I didn't ask to get bit by a tick. I didn't ask to be undiagnosed and misdiagnosed. And I certainly didn't ask to be medically retired from the career that I love. But here I am. So stop talking about what you can't do, Nicole, and ask yourself, what is it that I can do right now to move forward?
Welcome to Business Refocused, a podcast about the people, decisions, and strategies behind building a successful business. Each week, we talk with leaders and operators about what they're learning, what's working, and the challenges that come with growth. I'm Lindsay Sexton, and I'm happy to introduce you to my co-host, who just so happens to be my mom, Carey Wallace. Let's get into it. Hey, Mom, how you doing?
I am doing really well, Lindsay. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I just moved and I'm doing my first podcast in my brand new office. So it's nice, light and sunny in here. I've got a ton of windows. I'm very excited about this change for myself.
I am too. And I'm really glad you're moved so we can be done with the moving. I feel like we've been painting or moving or packing or unpacking for a couple months now. So I think we're all settled and everybody's going to stay put for a little bit, right?
Exactly. Yes, 100%.
Well, I too am super excited about today. I've been waiting and anxiously awaiting this podcast because I have the ability to travel around and speak all over the country at events. And I also, because I'm speaking at events, I get to hear some of the most incredible speakers as well. And today's guest, I will say, is probably the most memorable and moving speaker that I've heard easily in the past 5 years. So I am very thrilled to welcome Nicole Malachowski to the podcast. Nicole, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here.
Yeah. So before we jump in, I would be remiss if I did not properly introduce you to our listeners of who you are and why, and a little bit about you. I will not do it justice, but I'm going to do the things that jumped out at me. So first and foremost, for those that are listening, Nicole is a retired U.S. Air Force colonel. She had a 20-year career in the Air Force, and she flew competitively, did all kinds of stuff. But one of the coolest things is she made history as becoming the first female Thunderbird, number 3, if I'm not mistaken. And one of the coolest, proudest moments that you cited on your website was that you led the first fighter formation providing security for Iraq's historic democratic elections, which is pretty cool, I gotta say. You were inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame and the Women in Aviation's International Pioneer Hall of Fame. I mean, this is unbelievable stuff. But I will tell you, when I listened to you tell your story and stood on that stage, there was I felt like an hour passed within like 15 minutes. And the next thing I know, you were rapping. I'm like, oh, no. We're just getting started. I can't wait to hear more. So thank you so much for coming and moving that entire room.
Well, thank you. And that's very gracious of you to say all of that. And I'm delighted to know that my presentation resonated with you. I'm always cognizant that it's 60 minutes of people's time. And I want to make that time worth their while,
Yeah.
And I'm always hopeful that what I share allows people to leave the room thinking and feeling differently about themselves.
Definitely. Lindsay, I would say the same, right? Like it was fantastic in that room.
Yeah, I won't give away your entire speech you did, but, I remember feeling incredibly moved when you're talking about, I can't get something. And the answer was to loosen the grip.
Yeah.
Right. I feel like I recite that into my head in my head to myself quite often. Like, oh, you know what? I need to step away, go for a walk. I need to loosen my grip on this. I need to, hang on. I need to take a deep breath. I'm really like honing in on this too much. And at the end of the day, like, you need to take a deep breath and it's all going to be okay. Right. So it definitely stuck with me. That's 100% for sure.
I'm honored. I'm honored to hear that. It makes my heart happy to hear as a speaker, for sure. No, we don't stand on stage just to hear ourselves talk. We stand on stage to try to make an impact.
That's
to
right.
give people takeaways that are actionable. And the fact that you remember that loosen your grip story, which for your listeners is a metaphor. It's all about learning to fly in turbulence and how to stay in formation 3 feet away as a Thunderbird pilot. But that metaphor is, about us as human beings dealing with the change and turbulence in our own lives. And the takeaway that Lindsay's mentioning is all about, choosing to control the things you can control, which means proactively choosing to be efficient with all of our time, talent, and treasure. So I'm delighted you remembered that.
Yeah, I feel like you need like stickers or something that's like loosen your grip. Like,
wait a minute, Lindsay. If you go to NicoleMalachowski.com, I do have a shop. There are there is certain, but importantly, I'm not just selling my merch here. 100% of proceeds from my shop go towards nonprofits dealing with Lyme disease and tick-borne illness. So I'd be delighted if people went to my shop and bought some stickers.
Yeah, no doubt.
I love that. I love
no doubt. Well, I will tell you the most memorable thing wasn't. There were plenty of things in your speech that were memorable, but what caught me when we were in that room together, someone raised their hand and they asked you a question after this unbelievable career and flying with the Thunderbirds and all of this. Do you still fly? And your answer was shockingly no. And for the reason was you suffered an illness. So I'd love for you to tell that quick story, because I was like, this is where the story's beginning, in my opinion. So please, for the people that weren't in the room, please bring them up to speed, and then we'd love to dig in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Just for a little bit of context, I spent over 21 years as an officer and a fighter pilot in the Air Force. I flew in 3 operational F-15E squadrons. I've been in combat over 188 hours. Flew as an Air Force Thunderbird pilot in the F-16, served in the White House several times. All this to say, I was really what was considered, a high-performing person, right? I mean, I was physically fit, mentally fit, spiritually fit. Things were going really great in my career. And overnight, I fell ill. And I became a little bit of a medical mystery for several years. And towards the end of that mystery, I ended up being bedridden for 9 months, unable to walk, talk, read, and write. And I did another 1.5 years in rehabilitation to learn to walk, talk, read, and write again. So essentially lost about 2 years of my life. And during that time, the Air Force medically retired me from the career that I loved, from the career that was still, on the upswing with positive momentum, and from the career I dreamt about since, I was a 5-year-old kid. So overnight, I went from this really high-performing elite fighter pilot and officer to completely broken, to the point that I was 100% dependent on other people for all of my activities of daily living. And, just for the listeners, once I was finally diagnosed, we discovered that I had late-stage tick-borne illness. So I had Lyme disease and 4 other tick-borne pathogens. I'd gone undiagnosed and misdiagnosed for a little bit too long there. And eventually those pathogens broke through the blood-brain barrier to my brainstem, which is what resulted in that 2 years of being bedridden and housebound. So I had to find a way to come back, from the deep, dark depths of that change. And it was a bit of an existential crisis at the time, for sure.
Wow, that is unbelievable. So, obviously that had to be a complete and total shock. How did you, what was that road like in order to get to the stage where you're now speaking? Because when you said that, I wasn't able to talk, I wasn't able to walk, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, you just gave one of the most brilliant speeches I've ever heard. How can that possibly be? What did that look like? What did that journey, how did that happen?
And that's always why when I give these presentations, I leave this story for the very end, because it's almost like I bury the lead, right? I get to talk about being a fighter pilot, my teamwork and trust, lessons learned about accountability and leadership. And then boom, kind of drop it on the audience there at the end. I will tell you this, I am indeed the most accidental professional speaker you have ever met. There is no way that I would have ever predicted this as a second career, nor would I think this would be my 9th year doing it. I have to say, I absolutely love it. And there's a very practical reason how this turned out. In that 1.5 years, I was in rehab. I was dealing with very bad speech impediments, word finding problems, and I had a lot of memory issues. And as I worked with the therapist, they asked my family and me, bring in pictures from your past. And they would have me look at these pictures and go, do you remember this moment? Who is in this picture? describe it? What words would we use to describe the feelings? And as I progressed through a year and a half with these therapists, you start to become friends with them. And they knew I was in a low spot. Who am I if I'm not wearing my nation's uniform, right? What's my contribution to society if I'm not a fighter pilot? How am I going to provide for my family? Who's going to hire me now as someone who lives with a complex chronic illness and actually, disability? What am I going to do with myself? And so you start to kind of have those conversations with these trusted therapists. And one day the lady that was teaching me how to walk again, she goes, "Man, you could be a professional speaker." And I looked at her like she was crazy. I'm like, "What the heck is that?" She's like, companies have conferences and they pay speakers to come share their stories and ideas. And I'm like, "No way." Like, there's professional speakers, like people get paid to share their story. And she's like, "Oh yeah, there's a whole, speaker bureaus, speaker industries, conference, event planners." I'm like, "Wow, that's weird." And then I turned to her and I'm like, "Well, no one would want to hear my story. There's not a big deal about it." And that's when her jaw kind of dropped on the floor. She's like, "I've never met a woman in my life that's got your background and your experiences." And that's what the companies would be paying for, for you to talk about teamwork and leadership and resilience through your experiences, right? Through your paradigm, through your lens. And I kind of chuckled. I was like, whatever. So then she said these fateful words one day. She said, quote, "I know this guy named Tony from New York." Now, come on, Carey and Lindsay. That's how every good story starts, right?
That's right.
I know
of course.
This guy named Tony. And it ends up she'd been friends with a gentleman who'd been in the speaking industry for 40 years. We got on a phone call. That was 9 years ago. And Tony with the Domino Network has been representing me ever since. But when I give those speeches, those stories, those pictures that you saw on stage, Carey and Lindsay, are the pictures that I talked about in therapy.
Oh, wow.
So when I say
That's really cool.
Speaker, I am an accidental speaker. My life is nothing but TLC, which stands for timing, luck, and circumstance.
I love that. I love it.
Oh, well, in the transition, in my research from you, I found out that you were part of a team that helped transition administrations one to the next. So transition was something that you weren't necessarily unfamiliar with, right? When you entered this, probably not for your personal life. A lot of the clients that we work with, their entire lives, they've been independent insurance agency owners, right? So they've owned this agency, maybe their dad, grandpa, uncle, mom, anyone in their family, right, has owned it before them. And some of the times they're coming to us ready to transition themselves and not knowing where to go.
Yeah.
Which is why I wanted to have you on and have this conversation because, man, what a transition from being a fighter pilot one day to not being able to walk, read, write, and then transitioning into a second amazing career, speaking all over the world.
Yeah.
Where did you start? Right. I guess you started with Tony, but how did, what were the feelings you were feeling? What advice do you have for people in the transition? Like, it's such a hard thing to know where to go first.
Yeah. And, when we talk about, transitioning, it's very obvious when you think about a military officer, right? Transitioning from military service into the civilian world. But that transition looks differently for different people. But there's two kinds of transitions, right? The ones you expect and plan for, and the ones that you're forced on you, that are unexpected and rather disruptive. But either way, that transition, to your next chapter, your next adventure is going to be difficult, right? I mean, it's a challenge. It's change. Change is never easy. And I remember for me being very unexpected and a very unwelcome transition that, I had to afford myself the grace to grieve. It wasn't like I just transitioned overnight, my friends. I mean, this was probably a good 6 month to 9 month long process of me trying to get, reconnected with myself, get control of my emotions, get control of, my feelings again. And I don't think there's anything wrong with taking time to grieve. Look, there were tears. I'm not even going to, sugarcoat that. And I remember the day of my medical retirement from the military, 29 December 2017. The last 2 years, like I said, I'd been bedridden, housebound, going through therapies. To the military's credit, they kept me through the max therapeutic, benefit through all the therapies before they discharged me, or retired me. But I get to that day of my retirement and I'm home alone. And nobody from the Air Force called. I have
Oh.
never had an Air Force retirement ceremony. And in fact, some of my retirement paperwork was mailed to me in like a manila envelope. All this to say, like, this was a hard time. It was hard for my ego. It was hard for my identity. It was hard for my family. And I sat there rightfully feeling a little sorry for myself, crying for a few days. And then as I sat there one day, the words that came to my head clear as day, and they've become a mantra of mine ever since. And I hope the listeners take this to heart. The words that came to my head, call it the universe, call it God, call it nature, whatever works for you, were yield to overcome. And when I heard those words, yield to overcome, it wasn't about quitting, surrendering, or giving up. What it meant to me was full acceptance of the present moment. I didn't ask to get bit by a tick. I didn't ask to be undiagnosed and misdiagnosed. And I certainly didn't ask, to be medically retired from the career that I love. But here I am. So stop talking about what you can't do, Nicole, and ask yourself, what is it that I can do right now to move forward? And once that yield to overcome it switched the way I was looking at my situation, I started doing research on people who've reinvented themselves. None of us are immune from human suffering, right? And I'm not the only person this has happened to. So I started reading things, watching YouTube, this and that. And during that time, I came across a Japanese philosophy called Ikigai. It is spelled Ikigai. Now, I'm going to give a very Western, basic version of what is a very deep and beautiful Japanese tradition. And I want to make sure that I give it the due, reverence that it deserves. But very lightly, Ikigai is about finding your life's purpose. And it's a Venn diagram where you answer 4 questions, and these 4 questions, those answers overlap. It's you have to find something you love, something the world needs, something you can get paid for, and something you're good at. And as I went around answering those questions and trying to apply them to my life, the thing I kept getting stuck on was, what am I good at? Like, I'm just a fighter pilot. I fly planes. Like, who's going to hire me? What do I do? You can't be a fighter pilot in the outside world. And because of my brain injury, I can't fly for the commercial airlines. And I was really stuck on the what you are good at for weeks. It was so frustrating. And finally, one day it hit me. Ask the people who love me and know me best. So I went to those really close friends. I went to my husband, my family, and I said, what am I good at? And it was interesting because, like that therapist, you've got good stories to tell. You're actually a good storyteller. You share things in a way, that resonates and touches people. And that's where it all came together. This idea of being a speaker. And so I would suggest for those transitioning or looking for reinvention that look into that Japanese philosophy of Ikigai. I think it'll give you some good guidance.
Nicole, as you're saying this, I'm thinking of some of the agency owners that they know it's time. They're not passionate about what they're doing anymore. They know that they have the next generation ready to go, but they can't let go because they don't know what's next. And I think for all of us, it's hard for us to see ourselves differently than what we are today and be able to see the possibilities rather than the limitations. So I love that advice. I had never heard of that. I've heard versions of that, but and I also think we struggle with some of our own self-doubt. Like, if I only see myself this way and I can't imagine a different way, will I be impactful to the people around me? Will I still have a place? Will I still have friends? I mean, some of the people I work with, their clients have been their longest friends and they don't know what they'll do with themselves. So I love the idea of kind of flipping that on your head and saying you have to be able to find those possibilities and deal with some of the self-doubt that comes through that process. Was that something for you that you had to deal with?
Absolutely. I think the natural inclination when you spend an entire career, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years as a fighter pilot or an independent insurance agent, you start to pigeonhole yourself.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, what does an old retired fighter pilot do? They go fly for the airlines. Well, I can't fly for the airlines because of my medical condition. What is an independent insurance agent who's, raised up an agency for the last 40 years and is about to hand it off to their daughter? Who am I outside of this? And the way that I kind of cracked that nut is I really had to ask myself, the self-doubt comes from fear, right? A fear of failure, a fear of taking a certain level of risk in pursuit of, personal growth, fear of judgment. right? Fear of change. And I realized I had to get past that. Like, what is it you're actually going to miss, Nicole? What is it these independent insurers are really going to miss? And how can you fill that hole in a different way, that hole in your heart, you know? And so for me, people often look at me and they go, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry you can't fly anymore. Well, guess what? It is not the flying that I miss. When I asked myself that question, what are you really going to miss? I realized I'm going to miss being a part of a team. I'm going to miss leading airmen. And very selfishly, by becoming a professional speaker and leadership consultant, I fill that hole in my heart. Because for a day, right, I was with you and those independent insurance agents. You know, for a day, I'm part of those farmers or people in pharma or, you know, people working in finance or tech or whoever I'm talking to. And that's how I filled the hole in my heart. So my question to those going through transition is really dig deep. What is it you're actually going to miss? And it occurred to me that all of the characteristics and traits I honed as a fighter pilot, right? Discipline and commitment and resilience and confidence and all those things were exactly the traits, one, I needed to survive my illness and rehabilitate to a functioning adult. But two, were exactly the traits I needed to reinvent myself into this second chapter. And so what are those things as an independent insurance agent that you have honed? Those things that have made you a master of your craft, right, for your clients? And how can those be applied in a different way?
Yeah, it's a super great thing to challenge people to think about, because the reality is if it's not thrust upon you, many stay past when they should. And maybe that's not healthy for their business, or it's not healthy for their team, or it's not healthy for the next generation. So I love the idea of challenging yourself to think about those skills in a different way. And maybe, I don't know, really question the status quo of everything around you, right? Like, think about that and look at them as skill sets, not just to sell insurance or lead a team or all those things, because some independent insurance agents are some of the most personable people I know. They could,
Well, sure.
they could do all kinds of things for their community, and they already are, but how could they take that to the next level if they're not spending their time doing what they are? So yeah, I love that advice. And, in our world, we help them through that transition. We're trying to help them maximize the value of their agency and figure out what's next for them and leave their agency in a healthy position so it can continue into perpetuity as well. So that advice is huge, absolutely huge.
It just kind of hit me as I was listening to you. I mean, isn't that what insurance agents do? They help people through transitions. Look, insurance is there for the most difficult and hard times of people's life, whether is, a house fire or maybe a death benefit or, whatever, like all kinds of insurance. You're there on people's hardest days. You're there to help them transition. If you really sit and think about it, you can use those skills to help you transition too.
That's right. That's right. So I have a big question for you, and it's a little bit of a off the topic, but you said it earlier. You said being a fighter pilot or being in the Air Force was something you dreamed about since you were 5 years old.
Yes.
And that, to me, I would love to just talk about that for a minute, because most people dream about what they can envision, and they envision it because they've seen someone do it. So is that your story? Or was there another female fighter pilot that you were, aspiring to be, or how did that happen for you?
Well, it's a really, really great question, Carey. I get asked this often, and I was kind of one of those kind of odd kids who like knew what I wanted to do from a young age. And then I became maniacally focused. Like, I never had a backup plan. Since I was 5 years old, this is what I was going to do. What's interesting was that was 1979 when I was 5 years old. It was against the law until 1993 for women to be fighter pilots. So to your question, when I decided to be a fighter pilot, there weren't women fighter pilots. They didn't exist because they were not legally allowed to do so. And so I came from, your typical middle-class American family. I mean, how lucky was I to be born a woman in the United States? I never wanted for food on the table, a roof over my head. I had parents that were married over 50 years. All this to say, wow, what luck. There's so many young people out there that don't have that kind of solid foundation. So I have to acknowledge, that I was starting on second base, if you know what I'm saying, and how grateful I am for that. And both of my grandfathers had served in the military. My dad was drafted in the Army during Vietnam. Long story short, I knew from a young age, military service was honorable. It was noble. It was good. It was something that my family and society, applauded. And I loved going to like the Veterans Day parades and seeing people all in the matching uniforms marching together. I loved the color guard. That was really cool to a kid, right? And so around that time, the local air show came to town. And we were out at the air show like most families do when it comes to the area. And a jet flew by called the F-4 Phantom. Now, the F-4 Phantom was the workhorse of the Vietnam War. And it came by that runway low and fast. I covered my ears because it was loud. My whole body, my chest rumbled. I remember like smelling the smell of jet fuel and just, it was like sensory overload for a 5-year-old. You know how kids start shaking with excitement? That's what I did. And that was it, man. I was like, wait a minute, you can join the military and fly that? I'm going to be an Air Force fighter pilot. Now, at 5 years old in 1979, it doesn't even occur to you that someone would tell you can't pursue your dream because of your gender, right? Didn't even occur to me that it was against the law. So I was blissfully naive until about 6th grade. And in 6th grade, our teacher had us, one student stand up every Friday to say what they wanted to be when they grew up and how they were going to get there. So I stood up when it came my time and I said, I'm going to be a fighter pilot. Everyone in the class laughed. And my teacher said, quote, sit down and come back when you have something more realistic.
Oh
And
my goodness.
I remember going home and just crying that day. Now, keep in mind, this was 1986. Top Gun 1 had just come out, so this is extra like that I want to be a fighter pilot. But everything he said was actually accurate. I don't think he was trying to be mean. It was just that it was against the law. And so I committed at that time to become an Air Force pilot. I wanted to fly tanker refueling aircraft. I figured if I couldn't be a fighter pilot, I would still want to serve my country and I can give the gas and the fuel needed to those fighter pilots so they could get to the target and back. And so I found myself at the Air Force Academy, and somewhere between my freshman and sophomore year, that law changed. And I became amongst the first group of women who was afforded the opportunity to compete equally to become a fighter pilot. And during that time, I was still at the academy. There were 3 women selected to be the first: Jeannie Levitt, Martha McSally, and Sharon Presler. And so they weren't that much older than me, right? It was timing, luck, and circumstance, but they were the best choices and they became my heroes and my role models. And I'm delighted to say I still talk to all of them today.
Oh, wow. What a cool story. Yeah. But it is funny, like, you chose a profession that is male dominated, no question about it, because prior to that, it was against the law. I started my career in a tech startup, which was also male dominated. Insurance is very male dominated. I think over 75% of owners of independent insurance agents are male. Now, there's plenty of women in insurance, don't get me wrong, but they are not in the owner's chair. And if they are, it's certainly a minority. Tell me what that was like in something that was truly against the law. The law changed. Now you're one of those people rubbing elbows with someone who may not want you there. How about that?
Sure. I always like to say, I get asked this question a lot, and I understand why. I had a very successful career because of a lot of great men.
Yep.
I had great male instructor pilots, great male squadron commanders, great male supervisors. Because remember, there weren't women above me. So the fact of the matter is I had to get, lucky and have those great male leaderships. Now, I'm not going to sit here and sugarcoat things anyways, right? Because I think we know, especially being a woman fighter pilot in the 1990s, flying in combat over Kosovo, you can imagine that there was some chauvinism. And what I discovered was for people who were my peers, it was no big deal, right? Because people who were my peers or younger than me, they never knew an Air Force without women fighter pilot in it. So anytime I had issues, it became more of a generational problem. So the older, lieutenant colonels, generals, the ones who could remember an Air Force without women fighter pilots or without women Thunderbird pilots, those were the ones who would try to be, obstructive sometimes, challenge me unnecessarily, treat me, to a different standard. But what I tried to do during those times was focus on the majority, because the truth is the vast majority were either neutral or quite supportive, because as a fighter pilot, everything's very objective. you can either do it or you can't. You cannot fake, right, a dogfight. You cannot fake, taking out targets on the ground. As a Thunderbird pilot, you cannot fake flying 18 inches to 3 feet away from 5 other planes. And so to be a woman in a career field that has very objective standards and objective measures was certainly quite helpful. Now, when the rudeness and some of the chauvinism happened, especially when I was young and I didn't have experience and I didn't have credibility, look, I never let them see me sweat. But again, there were nights I went home, put my face in the pillow at 22, 23 years old and cried. I mean, that's just the truth. And I had to remind myself, look, this was my dream since I was 5 years old. I didn't become a fighter pilot to prove something to anybody. I didn't become a fighter pilot to break barriers or change cultures. I didn't do it to make these guys uncomfortable. I did it because it's my dream. This is my dream. And the jet could care less about your gender, your ethnicity, your religion, your orientation, any of that. Yeah. The jet just wants to be flown. And so I had to remind myself of that a lot. Just fly the jet.
It's interesting. I hate that question too, by the way. I asked it because I think it needs to be asked. But I also found myself in a room where I'm the only female or I'm the only whatever. And the reality is I got there because of a lot of great men that were incredible mentors, incredible advocates, incredible. So sometimes, I see a movement of women forming their own conferences and forming their own things. And sometimes I think we're actually taking ourselves backwards rather than forwards. I think you just want great, smart people together trying to solve things rather than trying to create one or the other. So I'm glad to hear your response to that.
It's a fine line to walk because I don't think we as a society are fully there yet. Because we do know that there are still there's some of that chauvinism out there. There's racism out there. There's, we're not in that place yet, but I acknowledge what you're saying. We need to be working in that direction. Watching the Artemis launch and watching the astronauts this week, right? The pilot, Victor Glover, happens to be a friend of mine. And he said something about, and I think he said it really well. He said, I think it's wonderful that there's young girls that can look up to Christina Cook. I think it's wonderful that little boys of color can look up at me and know, hey, that's possible. He goes, but I hope we get to a place someday where it's not just women's history or African-American history, but that it's human history.
Agreed.
And I think he's acknowledging that there's still value sometimes maybe in that women's conference or whatever, but we have to be moving in that direction. I just went to the largest women in aviation conference actually 2 weeks ago. And, thousands of people, but it's open to men. I was just tickled to see the number of men that were there. It's not exclusionary. It was inclusionary, but it did talk about some of those things that were female specific, such as children, right? How do you endure a pregnancy while flying in the cockpit? I mean, those are things that women need to talk about. So I've hit this point where I realize it does mean something to see someone who looks like you succeeding. And as much as sometimes I can bristle at being called, for example, the first female Thunderbird pilot, because I just want to be known as a good fighter pilot. I just want to be known as a great Thunderbird. At the same time, I can't deny the look on those little girls' faces in the autograph line, right? So I think there's a way to walk that line as we move towards Victor Glover's statement of human history.
So, Nicole, as we wrap up today, I'd love to ask you if you had to reinvent yourself again, hopefully by choice this time, not by a tick bite or a lightning strike or any other crazy rare things that could happen. Where would you start?
Where would I start? That's a tough question, Lindsay, because I am just so darn happy with where I'm at. I think this next phase of life for me that I think about or that I sometimes worry about is kind of be that empty nester, right? I got 2 15-year-old twins. They're going to be heading out the door, starting their own lives. My husband and I have been married 25 years. What does that look like? And, my husband and I have started talking about that. Like, what does it look like for the two of us to go into the older 50 and up kind of AARP card holding, people. We've worked hard, in our professions, both in the military and in these second careers to be able to travel, I see myself reinventing myself as just a global world traveler. I'm probably going to have some weird social media post or podcast where I just take people along, because the thing that brings me joy is meeting people, exploring new cultures, seeing different geography and landscapes, eating different kinds of food. So my reinvention, or whatever it looks like, Lindsay, is going to be based, I think, in curiosity. And I want curiosity to be the foundation for whatever it is that my husband and kids do moving forward.
I love that.
Yeah.
I'd also like to call dibs on being a guest on one of those traveling podcasts. I will be there, Nicole. Just let me know when.
Well, let me ask you this. Where's the most amazing place you've ever traveled that you would recommend?
The most amazing place. Wow. I've been very fortunate to travel quite a bit in my life. I feel like my husband would be mad if I didn't say my honeymoon. We went to a region in northern Italy called Cinque Terre.
Oh yeah.
And it's 5 hiking villages that are all beautiful on the water. And the reason I think it's very beautiful there and loved it so much is during the day, the cruise ships would come in and it would be absolutely flooded with people. Yeah. But we stayed there. We had like an Airbnb. And so early in the morning, which we're early risers, so we would like go out for walks early in the morning, and then late at night, there was like no one there. And, you could chat with the locals, go into the shops. They would have much more time to tell you stories about where they lived and what they're doing and all things like that. So I guess for me, it was the people too there, but man, that was beautiful, amazing.
Awesome. I'm adding that to my bucket list. Thank you.
Yes, go there. And my goal while I was there was drink a glass of wine and swim at all 5 cities. So carry that on to your list.
Admirable goal. I love it.
Well, Nicole, I will tell you one thing. I'm going to give you a bit of advice just because you shared the next phase that you're headed to. And I hear a lot of my friends, obviously I'm ahead of you in age a bit. My daughter is not 15. She is married and bought a house and unpacked and all that good stuff. And but many people start to feel like they're running out of time with their kids as they start to, get towards, graduating, et cetera. And I will tell you, many of my friends have figured out a way to spend more time with their kids than they expected as they're going through college and they're making their own life and all those things. And I would say curiosity and being able to connect in different ways pays off dividends, because I felt that. I know what that feeling is you're starting to approach empty nesthood. But I would just tell you, take a deep breath, loosen the grip. I guarantee you it gets better, my friend. It gets better. Yeah.
Awesome. That's great advice. I do appreciate that. And the loosen your grip is a story I tell on stage. And I got to tell you, Carey and Lindsay, sometimes when I'm telling that story on stage, in my back of my mind, I'm thinking, Nicole, you got to take your own advice.
That's
Thank
awesome.
you for the reminder.
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on. I truly do hope I get to hear you speak about your journey back. I'm glad that you shared it with us today, or at least a little snippet of it. And thank you again for being such a wonderful guest.
Thank you, ladies, for having me. All the best.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Insurance Refocused podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please be sure to hit subscribe and leave us a review so you'll never miss us. Want to learn more about how Agency Focus can help you grow your agency? Head to agency-focus.com or email Carey directly at carey@agency-focus.com. If you need to get in touch with me, feel free to shoot me an email at lindsay@agency-focus.com. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next week.